Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day, which should be a good one, I do want to remind you that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. But we're going to stick with this screen, and we are going to discuss a team in the midst of training camp. A team that certainly is going to be heavily scrutinized at almost every position in terms of fantasy. And that is the Cleveland Browns. And the reason why this is the only team that really intrigues me and catches my eye in terms of their training camp preparations is because of the storylines. So many different storylines at each and every position that really catch the eye. So, I just wanted to present some research. I read this in an article. I was inspired by it because of the intrigue surrounding the Browns, and I really wanted to get more in depth about how to view this team come fantasy draft time. Without further ado, let's jump right into what makes the Browns such an interesting team. And let's start off, before we get to our little graphics that I present, let's start off with the coaching. Let's start off with how I believe they set up, because Kevin Stefanski did come out and say, as the Browns head coach, that he was going to call the plays, ultimately calling the shots on the offensive side of the ball. And the reason why I like that more than, say, other people is because of what Kevin Stefanski brings offensively and what it means for Deshaun Watson, most importantly. Because when we think about Kevin Stefanski centered offenses and the kind of plays and variations he develops, I think the prime example of a season where a quarterback regained their form or found themselves was with Baker Mayfield in 2020 when the Browns made the playoffs for the first time in a very long time. The way Kevin Stefanski simplified the offense for him, really honed in on Mayfield's biggest traits and assets, and really developed him into someone who could be a competent quarterback, not have to do too much, but really focus on operating an offense at a high level. And I think that's what Deshaun Watson needs right now. Coming off a shoulder injury, hasn't really impressed with the Browns. A lot of guaranteed money on the line for both parties involved. And so this season really needs to be focused on simplifying things for Deshaun Watson so that he's not overwhelmed. He's not so consumed with trying to be the best. Because if he is, that's where we see all the pratfalls come into play. And so let's talk about Deshaun Watson. Now, like I said, coming back from the shoulder injury is definitely going to be the prime directive for Deshaun Watson. He's not at full health just yet. He's still training with padding and contact. Everyone's trying to implement that back into the system so that he's comfortable absorbing hits. And so I think the importance of that is that should Deshaun Watson have more RPO-oriented plays, let's say, I think it's very important that he's not scared to continue to develop the part of the game, because as a rusher in Cleveland, that's where Deshaun's had so much success. Where he hasn't had success is throwing early in downs and throwing in, first and 10, second and 10 situations. The Browns threw the football on 41% of their first downs. If that number reduces, then I think Deshaun's set up in a very nice little situation for himself. Because I think the best parts of Kevin Stefanski's offense is in late downs when you operate out of system or in the play action sets. And that's where a lot of Deshaun Watson's bread and butter is going to have to come from. A lot of his comfortability will have to surface from those areas. I don't think the Browns want to throw early and often. They have a setup where they feel comfortable enough relying upon their running backs. We'll talk about them a little later in this segment. instead of, just throwing the ball around. And have the wide receiver core now to really help them, but let it be on later downs so that Deshaun Watson can really settle into games, understand the flow of the game, and most importantly, not have to be the hero every single time. But let's talk about the weirdness of the running back situation, shall we? Obviously, we all know about what happened with Nick Chubb. Will he ever be the same? Will always be the question hanging in people's mind, because right now, he's in his age 30 season and in a contract year, and the Browns are going to have to decide fairly quickly whether or not Nick Chubb has anything left in the tank after an injury very similar to the one he sustained in college, where he did come back from that, but this is different. This is towards the end of his prime. And so, how the Browns handle him is going to really affect his fantasy stock as well, because they have very capable backs in Jerome Ford, Deontay Foreman, Pierre Strong, in every single situation that they want to use them in offense that can really help Deshaun Watson settle down. But there's not really an RB1 or even an RB10 for that matter in this offense. I think Jerome Ford has the explosiveness to potentially get a lot of good stats, but at the end of the day, the bottom line is there's no one quite like Nick Chubb that can really replace his value. And so the Browns have to hope that they can get at least some modicum of success out of Nick Chubb before it's too late. And I think that right now it's a very thin line between him succeeding and him ultimately getting closer and closer to retirement. Now, I think that being said, situational running back by committee approach for the Browns could be very helpful to them. I like Jerome Ford as an explosive guy who you might use more often at early downs. I like Pierre Strong as kind of a workhorse back. Deontay Foreman as well, perhaps more in the red zone. He's a very good red zone back foreman. And so I really believe that the loss of Nick Chubb, while it definitely hurts the fantasy stock, gives this team a lot of opportunities. Maybe one of these guys can emerge as a flex option or even a super flex option to really kind of be the surprise on your team. It can be a surprising player who could potentially win or lose you games. But this running back room is definitely going to be looked at a lot more closely because of what's happening with Nick Chubb. Let's talk about the wide receiver group. This definitely is one of those groups that's weird and wacky and fun to discuss because you have a clear number one, then there's a bunch of guys competing for that number two spot who have very different traits, and it's going to be very intriguing to see how all of them gel together. And that's the wide receiver room. Let's talk about them for a little bit. You have Amari Cooper, a consistent receiver, 1,000-yard receiver any given year. It should really be Deshaun Watson's go-to target. Then you have in this picture right here Elijah Moore, who I really like as a route runner. Very capable of making contested catches. Very capable of getting targets in the red zone. Then you have Jerry Jeudy now, who you acquired from the Broncos. And he's always been someone who I really want to see more because I think he has the traits to really be a very exciting, say, outside receiver who can really stretch the field vertically. And so the variance of the wide receivers in this Browns offense really excites me, and it should excite you as fantasy football managers. Because when you think about the wide receiver market, you don't really think about brand names on the Browns. Maybe you view Amari Cooper as someone like a Mike Evans, someone who I talked about in my mock draft, where he's just a very consistent player. But I think that the reason the Browns receiving room is not viewed as highly in fantasy is just because it's so well-rounded, it's so balanced. And while I like balance, I think that when you view an entire room compared to an individual, it brings a lot more perspective to who is better than someone else. If you're really breaking down wide receiver rooms here, I don't think you would view the Browns as one where there's a clear number one player who's going to get the bulk of the stats. I think it's very even. I think Amari Cooper, at the end of the day, is just someone who is a consistent player like Mike Evans, who's always going to be a wide receiver one, but never really get the respect. He's always going to be undervalued. It's just because of this wide receiver room. Who is going to be the guy behind Amari Cooper in the setup? And that's going to be the conundrum a lot of you face. But if there's one conundrum that you have no problem with, it's perhaps the conundrum of the tight end position, because David Njoku is also getting very undervalued. Last year he caught fire. That was obviously under Joe Flacco, so make of that what you will and see if he has the same kind of stats under Deshaun Watson. But at the end of the day, David Njoku kind of gets forgotten in this wild tight end market. I haven't even mentioned him. It's always been the old guard. It's always been the young guns. And David Njoku just finds himself sitting in the middle, kind of lurking in the background. But if you pick him up, he's going to be special for you. David Njoku is always someone who is going to be one of the most reliable players in this Browns offense. He's always the escape route. He's always going to be in Stefanski's plans, getting Njoku open, and special things happen. And the overall perfect fantasy player, especially from this crowded Browns offense, is perhaps Njoku. And when I fully assess this team, especially on the offensive side of the ball, and I think about what's best for them going forward, it's really keying in on getting Njoku involved in every single facet of this offense. Because if they do, that's where they got success. That's what happened with Baker. Baker found the comfortability in passing to his tight end a lot, and so did Flacco. And so that's what this Browns offense needs to succeed. Open it up for Deshaun. Get him more involved in play action. Get your best weapons involved. Find a secondary piece who can bail you out. And I think the Browns offense is going to be very diversified. And it's also going to be very intriguing for fantasy managers everywhere. That should just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we are on to one of my favorite players in all of college football. My favorite team in all of college football. That is, of course, Mr. Quinn Ewers. A big year ahead for this kid. We'll be right back to talk about him after the break.